Hey guys, Spudknocker here, as always. And today I figured we'd hop back in the cockpit of the A-18C Hornet and do an updated cold start tutorial video. Now it's been over a year since I've done a cold start tutorial in the Hornet, and a lot has changed about how to get the jet up and running and ready for combat. Now a lot of these changes actually relate specifically to the INS system and how to get the INS aligned properly and how to get it operating to safely navigate you through your taxi, takeoff, ingress to your target, flying in combat, egress away from the target, and navigating you safely back to your home base. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop in the cockpit and get out of this very hot Western Arabian Peninsula sun and get the canopy closed and turn on some AC. So we're currently here on Liwa Air Base in the southwestern portion of the UAE, getting ready to engage in some training operations with some fellow Kuwaiti F-A-18Cs as well as some Saudi Arabian F-15Cs. So let's go ahead and get started with this tutorial. Like I said, I wanted to go ahead and get that canopy closed nice and early, just so that way we could get ourselves out of the hot sun here on the Western Arabian Peninsula. Now keep in mind, you do not have to have your battery switch turned on in order to close the canopy. This is for two different reasons. What if I was trapped in the cockpit here in an emergency and the ground crew has to get the canopy open with no electrical power actually turned on in the jet? Secondly, the ground crew has to be able to raise and lower the canopy very easily while maintaining the jet without having to drain the main batteries within the jet itself. So just a quick little tidbit there. So let's go ahead and first engage our battery switch down here at the top of our right-hand console. Note that the generator switches are already in the on position and do not need to be moved at all. This is a change from the very first release of the F-18 where these were default set to the off position. Next, we can come over to the left-hand side of our cockpit, and just aft and outboard of our throttle, we have the APU switch. So we'll go ahead and turn the APU on and wait till we get a green light there. And we currently have a green light. So the first engine that I recommend you crank is always the right-hand engine. The reason for that is the INS draws its power from the right-hand engine, and so that way you can actually get the INS starting its alignment and get ready to go faster if you get that right engine cranked first. Now on the IFE, the Integrated Fuel and Engine Indicator, down below the left DDI, we can see the RPM of our right-hand engine climbing, and when it reaches the 29 to 30% mark, you then want to hit right shift home to bring the right-hand throttle into the idle detent, which will then continue the startup procedure, and we can see the engine temperature rising along with the RPM, and these should stabilize out at about 65% and roughly about 340 on the temp.
Roll left.
Temperature's a little bit lower than I would expect, but it is still good to go. And we can see we now are getting fuel indications because we have that right engine cranked. If we crank the left engine first, we would have to wait until we get the right engine cranked to get these fuel indications that we want. Next, we can go ahead and come down to our sensor control panel down here, which is the furthest aft panel that actually does anything for us in the game version of the F-18. And we go ahead and bring our radar into the operate position. Don't worry, you will not overheat it. With the weight on wheels, the radar will not be transmitting. And then we can take the INS knob and throw that into the ground position. Now we want to quickly turn on our screens, and at this point you can also turn on your HUD by increasing the brightness knob. And you can hit backspace to get rid of the stick, so that way we can see the MPCD very easily in front of us. Just going to wait until that MPC starts to come alive. And we can see down here we have a new OSB option on the MPCD when it's displaying the HSI page. And that is STD HDG for stored heading. Now if we click that, we can tell the jet that it needs to use its last stored heading. Like say if we had shut down in this spot right here on this heading, the last known heading in the INS system is now used as the current startup heading to allow the INS to align itself a little bit faster. Now as we wait for the INS to align, we can go ahead and crank the left-hand engine with a left click We can hear the little deedle, and then we know that that engine is going to start spooling up. We can see the RPM start to rise, and we can keep an eye on both the IFE and the INS countdown over here. And we can see the left engine is ready for the throttle to be put into the idle detent. We're going to hit right Alt and Home to bring the left throttle from the cutoff position to the idle detent. Now, as the INS starts to align on our MPCD, the actual map itself will start to be projected on the MPCD. Now, if you find this to be annoying and can't read the symbology, like I can't right now, you can always hit this middle left OSB button 2 times to turn it off. And then if you want it back on, just hit it 2 times to turn it back on. But we're going to leave it off for today because it's very difficult to see without it. Keep in mind that with the new way to align your INS, if you do not hit stored heading, the jet will go ahead and do a full alignment, which takes roughly about 8 minutes. Whereas this alignment, which now has an OK symbol up here, is showing us that it's good to go with only a time of about 1 minute and 40 seconds. So we can go ahead and now come back to our INS panel down here, and here comes the second change that we have here. We want to skip the nav position and throw it directly into the IFA position for in-flight alignment. What this does for us, it allows the jet to use GPS signals that it receives to keep the INS alignment updated and to update the position of the aircraft in space and time. So next we can go ahead and come to the lighting panel up front, and you can go ahead and turn on your console lighting or your instrument panel lighting. On a very bright day like today here in the Saudi Arabian desert, you may not need those, but those are there for you in low light situations. I always tend to kind of turn them on by default in whatever lighting situation I'm in, just so that way I can see the labels very, very easily on these right hand and left hand consoles in the cockpit that are kind of in the shadows. So now that we have that set up and ready to go, we'll go ahead and reset our FCS system. So we'll go ahead and press our menu OSB, the center bottom OSB, and come over to the FCS on the support menu. Next, I like to, in the F-18, always bring up my ADI page on my left DDI. So we'll then go ahead and reset the FCS. We want to press 1 click on the reset button and 1 click on the takeoff trim button. So with that, you should have the check flaps and check check seat and check FCS warnings turned off now. In fact, you won't have the check seat warning turned off because you need to have the ejection seat armed in order to do that. And so now you should not see any kind of warnings in the bottom of your left-hand DDI at this point. Now we can go ahead and continue with sweeping our cockpit for the rest of the things that we need to turn on. We do, of course, have our OBOGs turned on. Make sure that we have oxygen flowing into our masks so that way we won't pass out at altitude. That's something very, very important. That's easy to miss because it's right back here by our left hip and kind of easy to miss. Next, we want to turn on our position lights. In a high brightness situation like this in the middle of the day, we do not need our formation lights on, so no need to waste the light bulbs there. So we'll just keep those position lights turned on. Move on to the area near the parking brake. We want to make sure that because we're on a field here, we want to have the hook bypass set to field. We want to have our landing taxi lights set to on, and we want to have our flaps set to half. We can also see the flaps indicator as well as the gear indicator on the bottom here, just to the left-hand side of our IFE, underneath the station select for selective jettison. Also want to check and make sure that selective jettison is in the safe position, which it is by default in DCS. We also can go ahead and turn off our parking brake now that our INS is aligned. We also want to make sure that our anti-skid is set to on. This is important that it's on at an airfield, but if you're starting on an aircraft carrier, you want to make sure that it's set to the off position. This is simply because on an aircraft carrier, we do not want anti-skid to kick on and potentially release brake pressure when we don't want it to, and that way we could potentially taxi right over the side of the carrier. Very, very bad situation, and it has happened before in real life, so you just want to make sure that you have the anti-skid turned to off if you're on the carrier, turned to on if you're on an airfield. Like I said, flaps to half, and the launch bar, of course, is retracted, with that being wired in place in most land-based F-18s that are only land-based, like for the Kuwaiti Air Force. Next, we can go ahead and set a bingo quantity. I like to go ahead and set my Joker fuel, so about half of my current fuel. So I'm going to go ahead and set it for 8,000. And then once I reach 8,000, I like to then reset it down to half of that again and have that be more of my bingo setting. Next, we can go ahead and box INS on our ADI page. The reason why I like to have the ADI page up on my left DDI in the F-A-18C is because when I'm flying with a double ugly loadout or a massively asymmetrical loadout like is typical on F-18s, I like to have the slip skid indicator very prominent and on display for me as the pilot. These three boxes up top let me know where the slip skid indicator is moving. This bottom box out here will swing left or right, and just like any other slip skid indicator, we want to step on the ball and bring more rudder to whichever side the ball is swinging out to. This can also help you counteract and know how much rudder trim to input when you're flying with a double ugly loadout. Like I said, that is very, very common in the F-18, and that's why I like to have that up instead of the HUD repeater page. Next, coming to the UFC, we want to make sure we have our volume adjusted for our comms, as well as the brightness adjusted for our UFC here. Next, we want to go to IFF, make sure that is turned on. Very easy to miss in the F-18 because it is kind of a discrete thing where you have to actually press the push tile and then press the on-off button, unlike in the F-16 where you just flip a knob to the on position on the left-hand side of the cockpit. Next, we also want to have data link turned on. And there we go. We are currently ready to go and taxi in the F-18C and fly into combat. However, there are a few more things that we need to get as kind of housekeeping before we actually take off. Next, we need to uncage our standby ADI down here by right-clicking and dragging up on the pull to cage knob. Make sure that's reset back to the horizon. Next, we need to come down here to this little, what looks like a dial down here next to our bureau number plate. Then we can right-click and drag this up. You're going to hear a nice whoop whoop kind of sound, and that is the warning for whichever altitude you want to actually have the radar altimeter notify you, and you can set that bug to whatever altitude you specify. I usually like to have it at about 600 feet, as that's kind of the altitude I want to be at when I turn from my base leg to my final leg for a landing. Of course, we want to make sure that we have our wings set to the spread position and we have our hook in the up position, especially if we're here on a field. Make sure that our wings match the position of our wing fold mechanism. And coming back to the right hand side, we've already got our lighting turned on the way we want it to be turned on. We have our radar turned to the operate position. We have our INS set to the IFA position. And for the FLIR, we can go ahead and put that into the standby position, so that way the targeting pod is getting power and is getting ready to actually turn on. And that way we can just flip it to the on position once we're in the air and have the targeting pod up and ready to go whenever we need it. Next thing we also want to do is, of course, make sure we have our RWR turned on, or our raw gear. And that is just underneath your MPCD. You have an ALR 67 power button right here. You know you've hit the correct button when you have all of these lights turn on for the different buttons, and you hear that nice doo-doo-doo-doo kind of sound. And of course, we need to set our dispensers to the on position and get those ready to go. And with that, you are ready to taxi out and fly into combat in the F-A-18C Hornet. Now you can, once you get good at it, go through this very, very quickly and very, very efficiently and actually do some of these operations on the roll as you're taxiing to the runway if you're scrambling. If you're taxiing with a large flight of aircraft, I recommend not doing that because you need to have your head out of the cockpit as much as possible to make sure you're not going to run into anybody. So with that, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you guys give it a like and maybe even subscribe to the channel. And I hope you guys fly safe and stay healthy out there. See you later, guys.